Rain doesn't fall in this city so much as it arrives, all at once, like it's been waiting behind a door for the right moment to walk in uninvited. That's how I'd describe the night everything started, if I were the kind of man who noticed weather before he noticed the shape of his own life falling apart. I wasn't, back then. I noticed weather the way I noticed most things, a beat too late after it had already soaked through my collar. I was sitting across from a lawyer named Priya Anand in an office that smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, listening to her read a paragraph of my late grandmother's will for the third time, as if repetition might change the words. It didn't. The sentence stayed exactly as impossible as it had been the first time. The family bookshop and its adjoining property shall pass to my grandson Omar John upon the occasion of his marriage, solemnized and registered before his 30th birthday. I was 29 years and 10 months old. I had never been on a date I'd call promising, let alone a marriage. My grandmother had known exactly what she was doing when she wrote that clause. She had spent the last 5 years of her life telling me gently, and then, not so gently, that a man my age with my temperament needed someone steady beside him, someone to argue about paint colors with, and split the light bill with, and grow old and cranky beside. She died before she got to see whether I'd listen. The will was her last word on the subject, delivered from beyond any argument I could make back. I told Priya it was impossible. She told me I had 2 months. My grandmother used to say that a bookshop was just a house that had decided to love strangers instead of family, and that the trick to running one well was never forgetting that both kinds of love asked the same thing of you, patience and the willingness to be there again tomorrow. She said it to me the summer I turned 12, crouched beside me in the poetry aisle while I cried over a novel I'd read too young to survive without crying. And she never once told me to put the book down or toughen up or save my tears for something that mattered. She just handed me a tissue from her apron pocket and told me the story would still be sad tomorrow and the day after, and that this was, in her opinion, the entire point of good books. They kept their sadness intact for you, so you always had somewhere honest to put your own. She ran that shop for 41 years. She buried a husband while running, it raised a daughter who left and never quite came back and finished raising that daughter's son, me, in the narrow apartment above it. When my mother decided motherhood suited her less than the string of cities she kept moving through instead. My grandmother never made me feel like a burden she'd inherited. She made me feel like the best thing that shop had ever stocked, and when she died quietly in her sleep in the same bed she'd slept in for 4 decades, I understood without anyone telling me that the shop and I had become the same kind of promise to each other, that neither of us intended to disappear quietly, whatever the cost of staying turned out to be. That was the promise Priya's paragraph was threatening to break. Sitting in her office listening to the will's condition again, I didn't hear a lawyer describing an inheritance clause. I heard my grandmother stubborn even from the far side of her own funeral, telling me one last time that she thought I deserved a husband, a family, someone steady beside me, and that she'd loved me enough, and worried about me enough to bet the shop itself on making sure I finally listened. I want to say I handled that conversation with dignity. I did not. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside her office for 40 minutes, with the engine off staring at the steering wheel, doing the kind of math a person does when the numbers refuse to be anything but bad. The bookshop wasn't just a building to me. It held every version of myself I had ever liked. The boy who read under the counter while his grandmother sold poetry to strangers. The teenager who first understood he liked men while shelving a battered copy of a 100-year-old love story between 2 soldiers. The grown man who had, in the 2 years since her death, kept the shop alive on nothing but stubbornness and the small stupid hope that keeping the lights on would somehow keep her close. Losing it wasn't losing property. It was losing the last room in the world that still smelled like her. My best friend, a chaotic, generous disaster of a man named Fareed Massoud, found me still sitting in that parking lot when he came to bring me lunch. I hadn't asked for and wouldn't have eaten anyway. He listened to the whole ugly story with his arms crossed and his eyebrows doing something complicated, And then he said the sentence that changed the shape of the next year of my life. I know a guy. That, it turned out, was an understatement so profound it deserved its own award. The guy was Russell Hoover. Fareed had known him for years through some tangled photography world friendship I never fully understood, and he described him with a shrug that undersold the man so completely I should have been suspicious from the start. Broke photographer, needs money, won't judge you, keeps his mouth shut. That was the pitch. Fareed made it sound like hiring a plumber. I met Russell on a Thursday evening in a coffee shop with terrible lighting and worse music, and the first thing I noticed about him, before his face, before his voice, before anything, was that he had ink stains on two of his knuckles, like he'd been signing something in a hurry and hadn't bothered to wash his hands after. The second thing I noticed was that he looked at me the way you look at a photograph you're deciding whether to keep, carefully. Like the decision mattered more than it should have for a stranger he'd been told he might have to marry. "You're smaller than I expected," he said, which was not the opening I'd braced for, and also not remotely true. "I'm not small. I told him so." He almost smiled. Not quite, just the ghost of one crossing his mouth and leaving before it could commit to anything, and said he'd meant it as a compliment, though he refused to explain how. We talked for 2 hours that night. Not about the arrangement at first. Fareed had briefed us both separately, and neither of us wanted to be the one to bring up money first. Like naming the price too early would make the whole thing feel dirtier than it already did. Instead, we talked about the bookshop, and about his photography, and about how he'd grown up bouncing between foster placements in a way he described with a flatness that told me exactly how much it had cost him to develop that flatness. He didn't ask for pity. He'd have hated it if I'd offered any. So I didn't, and something in his shoulders eased when I let the subject move on without lingering. Only near the end of the night did we finally say the real words out loud. He needed money. Enough to keep his sister in the good care facility. She needed enough to stop the calls from collections agencies that he mentioned only once in passing. Like a bruise he was used to pressing on to check it still hurt. I needed a husband, on paper, for 22 more months than I had left before my 30th birthday turned my grandmother's gift into my grandmother's joke. "You understand, this isn't real," he said. And I remember thinking it was a strange thing to need to say out loud to a man he'd just met, as if I might have misunderstood the arrangement as an invitation into his actual heart. "I understand," I told him. He held out his hand like we were closing a business deal, which, in fairness, we were. I shook it. His grip was warm and a little too firm, like he was nervous and hiding it in his hands instead of his face. I didn't think anything of it then. I think about it constantly now. We spent the next week working out the terms with the kind of grim thoroughness usually reserved for corporate mergers, not marriages. Priya drafted a private agreement alongside the legal marriage certificate. Nothing a court would enforce, just a document meant to keep both our hearts safe from the arrangement's blunt edges. 2 years, renewable if either of us wanted it, though neither of us said the word aloud like we expected to use that option. A monthly sum transferred quietly to cover his sister's care. Separate finances otherwise, separate bedrooms, no expectation of romantic or physical involvement beyond whatever public performance the marriage required to hold up under scrutiny. A clause, half joke and half genuine concern on Russell's part, promising that either of us could walk away early if the arrangement ever started costing more than it was worth. "What happens," I asked him, "the night we signed that private agreement, if one of us breaks a rule we didn't think we needed?" He looked up from the page, pen still in hand, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "I suppose we'd have to write a new rule," he said, "and hope the other one agreed to it." I laughed it off at the time, assuming he meant something logistical, an argument over chores, a disagreement about how public we'd be with the fiction. I didn't understand, not yet, that he was already worried about a different kind of rule-breaking entirely, the kind that happens quietly in a person's chest without either party voting on it first. Farid, when I told him the terms afterward, shook his head at me like I'd missed something obvious standing directly in front of me. 2 years, he said. Separate bedrooms, sure. Good luck with that, given the way he looked at you the entire dinner. I told him he was imagining things. He told me, with the particular confidence of a man who has never once been wrong about this exact subject, that he wasn't imagining anything at all, and that I should prepare myself accordingly. I didn't listen. I rarely listened to Farid on subjects he turned out, infuriatingly, to be right about. The wedding was small fast, and almost entirely for the benefit of a courthouse clerk who looked like she'd seen 1,000 marriages exactly like ours and had opinions about all of them that she was contractually obligated to keep to herself. Russell wore a gray suit that didn't quite fit him in the shoulders, borrowed, he admitted later, from a friend built leaner than he was, and I wore the navy one my grandmother had bought me for her own funeral, which felt like either the most appropriate or the most inappropriate choice a person could make, and I never resolved which. We had rehearsed the vows the way you'd rehearse lines for a play you didn't care about, flat and functional, get the words out, don't trip over the legal terminology. But standing there in front of the clerk, watching Russell's throat move as he swallowed before his turn to speak, something in me went quiet in a way I hadn't expected. He said the words slower than we'd practiced. He looked at me while he said them, not through me, not past me toward the door, but directly at me, like he was trying to memorize my face for a photograph he'd never actually get to take. When the clerk told him he could kiss me if he wanted to make it official, no requirement, just tradition, she said, almost apologetically. He hesitated exactly 1 second too long for a man who'd told me 2 weeks earlier that none of this was real. Then he leaned in and kissed me, brief and dry and over before I could decide what to do with my own hands, which had come up without permission to rest against his chest. He tasted like the coffee we'd both had too much of that morning out of nerves. I remember that specific, useless detail more clearly than I remember anything the clerk said afterward about paperwork and processing times. I remember thinking, with the particular horror of a man watching his own plans catch fire in real time, that I had just made a catastrophic miscalculation about how easy this would be to keep purely business. He pulled back first, cleared his throat, signed the certificate with his ink-stained knuckles and handwriting too careful for a man who claimed not to care. I signed mine underneath his, and somewhere in that shared piece of paper, in that shared last name we'd agreed, I would keep as John Hoover for the sake of appearances. Something between us had already quietly stopped being paperwork, though neither of us said so out loud. Not yet. We moved into the apartment above the bookshop because it made sense for the appearances my family needed, and it made sense for the rent Russell couldn't otherwise afford. And for the first month we orbited each other like two planets that had been assigned the same solar system without being asked whether they wanted the company. He took the smaller bedroom, insisting the light was better for editing his photographs there, though I suspected he simply didn't want to presume closeness neither of us had signed up for. I left him alone in the mornings, made 2 cups of coffee out of habit before remembering only one of them was for me, and drank them both rather than admit the mistake out loud. It was slower than either of us probably meant it to be, this narrowing of the distance. It happened in small increments too mundane to notice while they were happening. He started leaving his camera on the kitchen table instead of tucked away in his room, like he trusted the space to hold something of his without it being questioned. I started leaving the good mug, the chipped one with the fading gold rim that had been my grandmother's, out for him instead of putting it away. Until one day, I looked up and realized it had quietly become his mug, without either of us deciding it formally. He photographed the shop obsessively in those early weeks, chasing the light through the front windows in the late afternoon, capturing the dust motes drifting over the poetry section like he was documenting something sacred instead of secondhand books and old shelving. I caught him once photographing me instead of the shop through the reflection in the glass display case, and when I asked what he thought he was doing, he said, without any of the deflection I expected, that I was the best thing in the frame and he hadn't been able to help himself. I didn't have a clever response to that. I don't think I said anything at all. I just felt something crack open in my chest that I'd have preferred, at the time, had stayed sealed shut. We fell into rhythms neither of us had planned. Sunday mornings became his to cook. badly enthusiastically with a stubborn refusal to follow any recipe as written, and I learned to eat whatever slightly burnt version of eggs he produced with a straight face and genuine gratitude, because watching him try mattered more than the eggs themselves. Weeknights became mine, closing up the shop while he sorted through contact sheets at the kitchen table. The two of us existing in companionable quiet that felt less like a business arrangement and more like something I didn't yet have the courage to name. The night I first understood how far gone I already was, we were sitting on the narrow balcony that overlooked the alley behind the shop, sharing a single blanket because the autumn had turned sharper than either of us had dressed for. And he told me about the year he turned 16 and aged out of the last foster placement that had ever felt close to home. About how he'd promised himself then that he'd never again let himself need anyone enough that losing them could break him. He said it lightly, almost like a joke at his own expense, but his hand found mine under the blanket while he said it, and he didn't let go for a long time after the words had stopped. "I think I'm failing at that promise," he said, so quietly I almost missed it under the wind. I didn't ask him to clarify what he meant. I was too busy failing at a promise of my own. The one where I'd told myself this marriage would stay exactly the size and shape we'd agreed to at that coffee shop table, no bigger, no realer. Nothing that could hurt either of us when the 2 years ran out and the paperwork could finally be undone. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. My Aunt Farida ruined the careful shape of our arrangement 3 months into the marriage over a dinner she'd invited herself to, the way she invited herself to most things involving my life and its decisions. She had never approved of my grandmother's will, had argued against the marriage clause loudly and often while my grandmother was alive, and had done a complete whiplash-inducing reversal the moment it became clear the marriage might actually happen, because if the shop was staying in the family, she wanted it to stay properly in the family, with an heir attached to make the inheritance clean for whatever children of mine she assumed would eventually exist. "A marriage isn't a family," she said, over a dinner Russell had cooked with more care than he usually bothered to fake for her benefit. "Your grandmother wanted grandchildren in that shop, running between the shelves the way you did. You know that. She'd have wanted it settled properly, not just a husband on paper." I told her, tightly, that a child wasn't part of the arrangement anyone had agreed to. Russell, beside me, went very still in the particular way he went still when a conversation touched something he hadn't decided how to feel about yet. "There are ways to do this now," Farida said, waving a hand like she was dismissing an argument rather than making one. "Surrogacy agencies, donor programs. You wouldn't be the first family to do it this way. Think about it at least, for her memory, if nothing else." Russell, to his credit, tried to steer the conversation somewhere safer, complimenting the food, asking Farida about her own children in a deft, deliberate redirection. I recognized even then as a kindness aimed squarely at me. She wasn't so easily steered. She'd never been the kind of woman who let a subject go simply because it made someone at the table uncomfortable. If anything, discomfort seemed to convince her she'd finally located the important part of the conversation. "You're not getting younger," she said to me, ignoring Russell's redirection entirely. "And neither is he, from the look of it. I'm not saying rush. I'm saying don't let the idea die just because it's inconvenient tonight." She turned to Russell directly, softening slightly, the way she did with people she'd decided, for reasons of her own, to like. "You'd make a good father. I can tell these things. You have patient hands." I remember Russell's face doing something complicated at that particular compliment. A flicker of something too fast for me to read properly at the time, gone before I could ask him about it later. I assumed, then, that it was simple embarrassment, the ordinary discomfort of being complimented by a near stranger at a dinner table. I understand now that it was the exact moment a seed my aunt had planted, thoughtlessly, over dessert, found soil in him that was far more fertile than either of us had any reason to expect. I told her I would think about it, mostly to get her to stop talking about it at my own dinner table. I did not, in fact, think about it. Not seriously, not as anything beyond the kind of guilt-laced obligation I owed my aunt exactly zero follow-through on. I assumed the conversation would die, the way most of her ideas died, in the gap between her enthusiasm and anyone's willingness to act on it. I did not know, that night, that Russell had heard something in her words that I hadn't. I did not know he'd sat with the idea of a child in a way I hadn't given him credit for, turning it over in the dark hours he claimed were for editing photographs, thinking about the family he'd never gotten to keep and the one he might for the first time in his life actually be allowed to build. I didn't know because he didn't tell me. That silence would cost us both more than either of us understood while it was still small enough to fit inside a single unspoken thought. The papers started appearing on the kitchen table in the 5th month, official-looking envelopes with return addresses I didn't examine closely because Russell always gathered them up before I had reason to. He told me they were related to updating our joint accounts, standard things a married couple needed to keep straight for tax season. Technicalities Priya Anand's office had recommended, so the marriage would hold up under whatever scrutiny my extended family might eventually apply to it. I signed where he indicated, on lines he'd already flagged with small sticky arrows, in the trusting, distracted way you sign things for someone whose handwriting you've already learned to recognize on your own mail. I didn't read the documents closely. I want to be honest about that because it matters later, because it's the detail I keep turning over even now, trying to decide how much of what happened was done to me and how much I simply let happen by not looking hard enough at what was in front of me. I trusted him. That trust had grown so gradually in such small, unremarkable increments. A shared mug, a shared blanket, a hand that found mine under it, that by the 5th month, I didn't think to question a stack of papers. He slid toward me with an explanation that sounded reasonable and a face that gave away nothing. He was distracted more often that season. He took calls in the stairwell instead of the kitchen, his voice low, cut off the second he heard my footsteps on the stairs. He came home some evenings smelling faintly of hospital antiseptic, a detail I filed away and then dismissed as related to visits to his sister, whose care facility he mentioned often enough that the smell made a kind of sense. I didn't examine further. He started leaving the apartment on Tuesday afternoons with a folder tucked under his arm and no explanation beyond errands, delivered in a tone that discouraged follow-up questions. I told myself I trusted him. I told myself that a marriage, even one that had started as a transaction and quietly become something neither of us had a name for yet, deserved that much benefit of the doubt. I didn't know, not fully, not yet, how much that benefit of the doubt was costing me in information I desperately need later. The thing I actually noticed, in that stretch of months, was how much less like an arrangement it felt, and how much more like a marriage it had somehow become without either of us formally agreeing to the promotion. He started reaching for my hand in public without thinking about it first, a habit that had crept in sometime between month 3 and month 6 without either of us marking the exact day it started. I started introducing him to people as my husband without the mental asterisk I used to attach to the word. We fought once about something as small as whose turn it was to restock the register drawer, and made up an hour later on the balcony with a tenderness that felt entirely too real for two people who'd signed a contract with an expiration date. There was a stretch of illness that winter, a bad flu that took me down hard enough that I couldn't stand upright without the room tilting sideways, and Russell became someone I hadn't fully met yet, brisk, competent, unwilling to be argued out of caring for me no matter how firmly I insisted I could manage on my own. He canceled 2 shoots that week without telling me until after the fact brought soup he'd clearly followed a recipe for, this time precise measurements and everything, and sat on the floor beside my bed reading aloud from whatever paperback happened to be closest, his voice low and steady until the fever finally broke somewhere around 3 in the morning on the 3rd night. I woke that final night to find him asleep, sitting up, his head tipped back against the wall at an angle that would leave him aching in the morning, one hand still resting on the blanket near my hip like he'd fallen asleep in the middle of checking on me and hadn't wanted to stop even unconscious. I watched him for longer than was strictly necessary in the particular quiet of 3 in the morning when a person's guard is down enough to admit things daylight makes easier to deny and understood. With a clarity that frightened me that I did not want this arrangement to end in 2 years. I did not want separate bedrooms to remain separate. I wanted, with an intensity that had crept up on me one small kindness at a time, for this fiction we'd built to become the realest thing either of us had ever agreed to. I didn't tell him that night. I told myself there would be a better time, a clearer moment, a version of the conversation that wouldn't risk the fragile, generous thing we'd built out of 2 strangers' desperation. I didn't yet know that Russell was lying awake some of those same nights, wrestling with a version of the exact same fear, and that both of us, in trying to protect what we'd found by staying quiet about it, were quietly building the very silence that would almost cost us everything a few months later. I fell in love with him somewhere in those months. I can't point to the exact day. I only know that by the time autumn turned into the deep cold of winter, the thought of the marriage ending on schedule had started to feel less like the relief it was supposed to be and more like a small private catastrophe I hadn't told anyone about, including him. There was a night, early in that 2nd month, when the lines between arrangement and marriage blurred so completely I almost said something I wasn't ready to say. My extended family had organized a dinner to formally welcome Russell, my mother's cousins, aunts. I saw twice a year, a scattering of second cousins who'd never bothered learning my name properly and weren't about to start learning his. I'd warned him it would be exhausting. I hadn't warned him how exposed it would feel, presenting a marriage built on paperwork to a room full of people who expected to see love and would be disappointed by anything less convincing. He was extraordinary that night, in a way that unsettled me more than any failure could have. He remembered names I'd only mentioned once in passing. He laughed at my uncle's terrible jokes like they were genuinely funny and touched the small of my back when he crossed a room to refill my glass. An easy, unthinking gesture that made my skin feel too warm for the rest of the evening. When my cousin Layla cornered him near the dessert table and asked not unkindly how we'd fallen for each other, he told a story about the coffee shop and the terrible lighting that was technically entirely true, and delivered it with so much genuine warmth in his voice that I found myself believing it right alongside her, as if I hadn't been sitting across that same table watching the actual uncertain beginning of it happen. I confronted him about it in the car afterward, not with anger, but with a confusion I couldn't quite name. I asked him how he'd made it look so effortless, pretending to love a stranger in front of a room full of people who mattered to that stranger. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the streetlights slide across the windshield. I wasn't only pretending, he said finally, careful with every word, like he was testing whether the sentence would hold his weight before he committed his full self to it. I don't know what to call what I feel yet, but it isn't only pretending, Omar. I need you to know that. I didn't ask him to say more. I wasn't ready to hear it, and some instinct told me he wasn't ready to explain it either. We drove the rest of the way home in a silence that felt for the first time less like the absence of words and more like the two of us quietly agreeing to let something grow before either of us tried to name it out loud. The fight that nearly ended everything happened on a Wednesday in late winter when I found the nursery. I hadn't been looking for it. That's the part I keep insisting on, in my own head, even now. I wasn't snooping, wasn't hunting for evidence of some betrayal I'd half suspected and half refused to name. I was looking for a spare bulb for the reading lamp in the shop, and the storage closet at the end of the hall, the one we'd never gotten around to clearing out, seemed like the obvious place to check. Instead of bulbs, I found a crib, disassembled and wrapped in plastic, tucked behind a stack of boxes I'd assumed held old photography equipment. I found a small dresser, unfinished but clearly intended for a nursery, sanded and half-painted a soft, uncertain yellow. I found a folder of receipts from a fertility clinic 3 towns over and beneath that a single sonogram photo, black and gray and utterly unmistakable in what it showed, dated 11 weeks earlier. With a name printed at the top of the printout that was not mine, but a name I recognized instantly because it was the surrogate agency's intake form, and beneath the grainy image in the space marked intended parents was my own name, Omar John, listed, signed. Legally, officially, on paper, I apparently had signed myself, months earlier, in a stack I'd trusted without reading. I don't remember walking back downstairs. I remember standing in the kitchen with the sonogram photo shaking in my hand hard enough that the image blurred, and I remember Russell walking in from the shop keys still in his hand, freezing the moment he saw what I was holding. "Omar," he started, and I heard, in that single syllable, every excuse he was about to reach for, and I didn't want to hear a single one of them. "You made me a father," I said, and my voice came out so much smaller than the size of the words. "Without telling me. You had me sign paperwork I didn't read because I trusted you, and somewhere in that paperwork was consent to a child neither of us discussed. And now there's a woman carrying a baby with my name on the intake form, and you didn't think that was worth a conversation?" He didn't defend himself the way I expected. He didn't argue that I'd technically signed the forms, didn't hide behind the legal technicality that would have been the cruelest, truest thing he could have said. Instead, his face did something I'd never seen it do before. It crumpled, all at once, the careful composure he wore like armor falling away to show me something raw and frightened underneath. "I didn't know how to bring it up without it sounding insane," he said. "I kept meaning to. Every week I told myself this was the week I'd tell you properly. And every week it felt like the wrong moment, and then it was too far along to feel like a small conversation anymore. And I was scared that if I told you the truth, you'd say no, and his voice broke in a way I'd never heard from him. "I wanted this so badly, Omar. A child. A family that was actually mine to keep, not borrowed, not temporary. And somewhere in wanting it that badly, I stopped being honest with you, and I know that's not an excuse. I know it's the opposite of an excuse, but I need you to know it wasn't done to hurt you. It was done because I was terrified of losing the one thing I'd let myself want in years." I should have found something gentle to say to that. I didn't have it in me, not that night. What I had was a sonogram photo still shaking in my hand, and a fury that felt less like anger at him specifically and more like grief for every version of trust I'd extended without checking whether it was safe to. I told him I needed space. I told him I didn't know, in that moment, whether I could forgive being made a parent without my knowledge, however gently intentioned the deception had been. I packed a bag I didn't need and slept at Farid's apartment that night, and for 6 weeks after we lived in the same building above the same bookshop, like two strangers who happened to share a mailbox, speaking only when the shop required it, sleeping in separate rooms with a closed door between us that felt some nights like the loudest thing in the apartment. Those 6 weeks were the longest of my life, and I don't say that lightly, given the year I'd had. I missed him in ways that embarrassed me, missed the specific, ordinary things. His badly cooked eggs, his ink-stained knuckles, the weight of his hand finding mine under a blanket on a cold balcony. I missed him even while I was still angry, which was its own particular misery, loving someone and resenting them at the same time and not knowing which feeling to trust. Farid, to his credit, refused to take sides in any satisfying way. He listened to me rage about the paperwork, about the months of secrecy, about the specific violation of having a decision that big made partly without my informed consent, and then he'd ask gently whether I'd actually stopped to imagine what it must have cost Russell to want something so badly and be so certain from a lifetime of losing things that wanting it out loud would make it disappear. "That doesn't make it okay," I told him. "No," Farid agreed, "but it might make it understandable. Those aren't the same thing, but they're not nothing either." I thought about Russell's flat voice describing aging out of foster care, about the promise he'd made himself never to need anyone enough to be broken by losing them. About the way his hand had found mine that night on the balcony, like he was testing whether it was safe to hope again. I thought about how frightened a person would have to be, how sure that good things vanished the moment you spoke them aloud. To build an entire secret nursery rather than risk a single conversation that might end in the word no. I didn't forgive him all at once. Forgiveness rarely works that cleanly, whatever the stories tell you. But somewhere in the fourth week of that separation, my anger started making room for something else beside it. A slow, reluctant understanding, and underneath that, unmistakably, the same love that had been growing in me since a courthouse kiss I hadn't planned for. I started leaving the shop early some evenings, driving past our building slowly instead of parking, watching the light in the kitchen window like it might tell me something about whether it was safe to come home. Russell called 4 times in those 6 weeks. I let all 4 go to voicemail and then listened to each one alone in Farid's guest room with my knees pulled up to my chest, like a teenager nursing a heartbreak instead of a grown man avoiding his own husband. The first call was short, just an apology looping in on itself, unable to find its own ending. The second was longer and steadier and told me, carefully, like he'd rehearsed it, that he understood if I needed more time, that he wasn't calling to rush me, only to make sure I knew the door was open whenever I was ready to walk back through it. The third call, he didn't leave a message at all, just 30 seconds of him breathing, like he'd dialed out of instinct and lost his nerve the moment the recording started. The fourth, left at 2 in the morning on a night I later learned he hadn't slept at all, was the one that undid something in me I'd been holding rigid out of pride. "I'm not going to keep calling and making this about what I need from you," his voice said, rough with exhaustion. "I just wanted you to know I finished the nursery. I painted the dresser the color you liked when we saw it in that shop window last spring, the one you pointed at without saying anything, and I pretended not to notice you wanting. I don't know if that means anything to you anymore. I just wanted it to exist as something true, even if you never come back to see it." I played that message 6 times before I made myself stop. Farid found me sitting on the floor of his guest room with my phone in my lap and my face wet, and instead of saying anything wise, he simply sat down next to me shoulder to shoulder and let the silence do the talking neither of us seemed capable of. After a long while, he said, quietly, that grief and anger were allowed to share a house for a while, but that eventually somebody had to decide which one got to keep paying the rent. I didn't have an answer for him that night. I only knew lying awake afterward that the yellow dresser Russell had finished painting alone for a daughter he wasn't certain I'd ever agree to meet, had done more to soften me than any apology he could have constructed on purpose. I went back to the shop on a Sunday afternoon near the end of that 6th week, telling myself I only needed to check the inventory. A lie so thin, I don't think even I believed it while constructing it. Russell wasn't there. He'd taken to spending Sundays at the fertility clinic's small counseling office. I'd later learned, talking through his own guilt with a therapist the agency had recommended for intended parents under stress, a detail that undid me all over again once I finally heard it. The shop was quiet in the particular way it only got on slow Sundays. Dust drifting visibly through the front windows in a long gold shaft of afternoon light. And I found myself standing in the poetry aisle exactly where my grandmother used to crouch beside me with tissues from her apron pocket. I picked up the same battered book I'd been reading the day she found me crying over it as a boy, a 100-year-old story about 2 soldiers who loved each other across a war that never let them say so out loud, and sat down right there on the floor between the shelves, the way I used to as a child, and let myself finally cry properly for the first time since the sonogram photo had shaken in my hand. I cried for the 6 weeks of silence, for the fear that I'd let my pride cost me the one thing I hadn't let myself admit I wanted more than the shop itself. I cried too for Russell, for the particular loneliness of a man who'd spent his whole life learning that wanting things out loud made them disappear, and who had, in trying to protect himself from that old lesson, nearly proven it true in exactly the way he'd feared. I didn't call him that day. I wasn't ready, not quite, though the distance between not ready and ready had narrowed to almost nothing. I put the book back on the shelf, straightened it so its spine sat flush with the others, the way my grandmother had taught me a well-loved shop should always look, cared for, even in its most private corners, and drove back to Farid's apartment with something loosened in my chest that hadn't been loose in 6 weeks. I hadn't decided to go back yet. And then, on a bitterly cold evening in the 6th week, before I'd found the words for any of it, The decision was taken entirely out of my hands. The call came at 11:40 at night, while I was still at Farid's apartment, half asleep on his couch with the television playing something neither of us was watching. My phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, a hospital exchange, and some old instinct made me answer instead of letting it go to voicemail the way I usually did with unfamiliar numbers. "Is this Omar John?" A woman's voice asked, brisk and professional in the specific way of someone trained to stay calm in emergencies. "We have you listed as an intended parent and emergency contact for a delivery currently in progress. Your surrogate went into labor early. She's 34 weeks, which puts your baby in a category we monitor closely. But everything so far looks stable. We tried your husband first. He's already on his way, but he asked us to call you directly as well, in case he hadn't reached you." I don't remember standing up off Farid's couch. I remember the phone nearly slipping out of my hand. Remember Farid's face changing from confusion to alarm as he watched whatever was happening on mine. Remember the woman on the phone repeating my name. "Mr. John? Are you still there?" Exie. Before I managed to say yes that I was on my way, that I understood, though I understood almost nothing beyond the fact that a baby, a real baby, was arriving into the world right now with my name attached to it, ready or not. The drive to the hospital took 11 minutes and felt like 11 hours. Farid drove because my hands wouldn't stop shaking enough to trust them with a wheel. And somewhere around the halfway point, I started crying in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sheer, overwhelming size of what was happening. The fact that in some maternity ward across the city, a woman I'd never met was in labor with a child that was on every piece of legal paper that mattered, mine. Ours. I found Russell in the waiting area outside the delivery ward, pacing a groove into the linoleum, his hair disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it for the better part of an hour. His eyes red, in a way that told me he'd already been crying before I arrived. He stopped the moment he saw me. For a second, neither of us moved. 6 weeks of silence and hurt and longing crowding into the space between us. Until he crossed the distance in 3 long strides and pulled me into his arms so tightly I felt the frantic drum of his heartbeat against my chest. "I'm sorry," he said into my hair, the words coming out cracked and urgent. I'm sorry. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I should have trusted that you'd have wanted this with me if I'd just asked instead of hiding it. I was so scared of losing you that I did the exact thing that could actually lose you, and I've hated myself for 6 weeks. And now, she's in there, and it's happening, and I don't know how to do this without you. I don't want to do any of it without you. I'm here, I told him, and meant it more completely than I'd meant almost anything in my life. I'm here, Russell. I'm not going anywhere. A nurse passed through twice in the first hour to update us in small, careful sentences designed not to promise more than the situation could bear. The baby's heart rate was steady. Delphine was doing remarkably well for a labor that had arrived 5 weeks ahead of its own schedule. The early team was simply being cautious, the way early teams always were. Each update sent a fresh wave of relief through both of us, followed almost immediately by a fresh wave of terror at how much was still outside our control. How much of this enormous, life-altering event was happening in a room we weren't allowed into, yet attended by people whose faces we hadn't even seen. We sat together in the hard plastic chairs of that waiting room for 2 hours that felt endless, his hand crushing mine, both of us flinching at every set of footsteps that passed the door, at every muffled sound from beyond it. He told me in fragments everything he hadn't been able to say before. How he'd contacted the agency the week after my aunt's dinner, not planning to go through with anything, just wanting to know what the process even looked like. How one appointment had led to another, each one small enough that stopping felt harder than continuing. How somewhere in the 4th month he'd realized he was in too deep to undo it without breaking something, and had told himself he'd explain everything once the pregnancy was confirmed stable, and then once it reached the 2nd trimester, and then once it reached the 3rd, each deadline sliding further away as his fear of my reaction grew alongside the baby he'd started helplessly to love before it even existed outside its mother's body. I should have asked you, he said again, quieter now, exhausted by his own confession. I know that. I knew it every single day I didn't. You should have, I agreed, because it was true and because pretending otherwise would have cheapened both his apology and my forgiveness. But I understand why you didn't, Russell. I understand what it costs a person to ask for the thing they want most, when every other time in their life the asking has ended in losing it anyway. He looked at me like I'd handed him something he hadn't dared hope for. You forgive me? I love you, I said, and it was the first time either of us had said the word out loud, 6 weeks too late, and exactly on time, all at once. I've loved you since the courthouse, I think, since before I had any business loving my own fake husband. I forgive you. I'm furious with you, and I forgive you both at the same time, and I need you to never do that to me again, not because the outcome was wrong, but because I deserve to be trusted with the truth, even the terrifying parts. Never again, he said, and kissed me there in that fluorescent-lit waiting room like it was the only vow that had ever actually mattered, realer than the one we'd exchanged in front of the clerk, realer than any paper either of us had signed. The baby arrived at 3:17 in the morning, 5 weeks early, small and furious and perfect, with a cry that filled the delivery room like she'd been waiting her whole short existence for the chance to announce herself properly. They let us both in before the surrogate, a steady, generous woman named Delphine, who had carried this child for us with a grace I don't think I ever thanked her enough for, had even finished the last of the delivery because the paperwork Russell had filed, the same paperwork that had broken my heart 3 months earlier, named us both as the fathers waiting to receive her. I held her first, because Russell insisted, his hand shaking too badly with adrenaline and relief to trust himself with something so small and so early. She weighed almost nothing. Her whole hand, when I offered her one finger, wrapped around barely half of it, and something in my chest that had been braced and guarded and careful for 29 years simply gave way at the sight of that tiny, stubborn grip. She's real, I said stupidly because it was the only sentence that would come, because 6 weeks earlier she had been a black and white shadow on a sonogram printout that had broken something between us, and now she was here, warm and breathing and screaming her outrage at the cold hospital air. She's real, Russell agreed, his voice wrecked with the kind of joy that has crying built into it whether you want it there or not. He reached out and touched her cheek with one careful finger, the same knuckles that had been stained with ink the first night I met him, now trembling against skin barely an hour old. Omar, we have a daughter. We named her Amira after my grandmother, the woman whose stubborn will had started this entire impossible chain of events. The woman who had wanted grandchildren running through the shelves of her bookshop and who would never get to meet the one who'd actually arrived. 5 weeks early and completely unplanned by anyone but the 2 men who loved her before she'd even drawn her first breath. The first weeks of her life were a blur of incubators and careful monitoring since 5 weeks early meant a stay in the neonatal ward none of us had prepared for. Learning the particular vocabulary of that world, feeding tubes and oxygen saturation, and the small victories nurses celebrated with us in soft, encouraging voices. Russell barely left the hospital those first days, sleeping in a chair beside her incubator, more often than in an actual bed, photographing her constantly, even then tiny and wired and fighting. Because he said he never wanted to forget how hard she'd worked just to arrive on time for a life that had started 5 weeks ahead of schedule. I brought him clean clothes and forced him to eat proper meals and sat beside him through the long, frightened nights when her numbers dipped and the nurses moved a little faster than either of us liked. And somewhere in those nights, watching him love our daughter with a ferocity that had nothing left in it of the careful, guarded man I'd first met in a badly lit coffee shop, I understood that whatever fear had made him hide the truth from me for those long months, it had never once touched the size or the honesty of what he felt for her. Delphine visited twice during that stay, standing at the incubator glass with an expression I still don't have words for, something between grief and joy and a fierce protective tenderness for a child she'd carried and was now gently and deliberately letting go of, into our hands. She told us the second visit that she'd known almost from the beginning that this baby belonged to us in every way that mattered, and that carrying her had never once felt like anything but an act of building a family that wasn't biologically hers to keep, and that she wanted nothing more, watching Amira's small chest rise and fall inside that incubator, than to see the two of us finish the job of loving her properly. Amira came home 3 weeks after that terrifying luminous night in the delivery ward, small enough still to fit along the length of Russell's forearm, and the apartment above the shop that had spent months holding a secret finally filled. Instead, with the ordinary, exhausting, magnificent chaos of two new fathers learning a language neither of them had been taught, feedings at impossible hours, a crib that squeaked in a way we both grew strangely fond of, a rotation of lullabies. Russell hummed off key with a tenderness that undid me every single time. The months that followed were nothing like the arrangement Russell and I had shaken hands over in a badly lit coffee shop the year before. There was no more pretending, no more careful business language, no more clock counting down toward an expiration date neither of us wanted anymore. Priya Anand redrew the paperwork within weeks, not to end anything but to make official what had already become true in every way that mattered: a real marriage, a real family, a real inheritance that would now pass not just to me, but to my daughter and to the man I'd married twice, once for a will and once quietly for myself. We brought Amira home to the apartment above the shop in early spring, into a nursery that had sat wrapped in plastic and secrecy for months and was finally unpacked properly. The half-painted dresser finished at last in a soft, confident yellow that Russell chose while she slept against his chest in the evenings. My Aunt Farida cried the first time she held her. Actual tears, the kind she'd have denied under oath, and admitted for the first time that she'd never expected any of this to go quite this well, quite this real. I still keep the sonogram photo, the one that started the fight that nearly ended us, tucked into the frame beside our wedding photo on the shelf behind the register, where my grandmother used to keep her ledgers. Customers ask about it sometimes, about the strange pairing of a grainy black and white print beside a formal wedding portrait. And I tell them, the short version, that my husband made me a father before he made himself brave enough to tell me, and that somewhere between the anger and the terror and the 3:17 in the morning arrival of the most stubborn, perfect person I have ever met, we became the family neither of us had let ourselves believe we were allowed to have. Russell still photographs the shop obsessively chasing the afternoon light through the front windows, and these days there's always a small determined shadow crawling somewhere in the frame. Dust motes catching in her dark hair the same way they used to catch in mine when I was small enough to hide under the counter and read. He photographs her constantly, and me and the three of us together in the mirror behind the register, building an archive of a family that started as a lie on paper and became one stolen glance and one late-night confession at a time, the truest thing either of us has ever built. Some nights after Amira finally sleeps, Russell and I sit on that same narrow balcony sharing the same blanket, his hand finding mine, the way it always has since that first cold autumn. And I think about the version of me who sat in a lawyer's parking lot 2 years ago, certain his life was about to shrink down to nothing but loss. I want to reach back and tell that man that he had no idea that the fake husband he was about to hire out of desperation would become the realest thing that ever happened to him. That the marriage he entered to save a bookshop would end up saving something far larger than a building, that a hospital would one day call his name for a baby he hadn't known was real, and that when it did, he would run toward that call with his whole heart without a single hesitation, because by then there had never been anything fake about any of it at all. Amira is walking now, unsteady and delighted with herself, chasing dust motes across the same floorboards my grandmother once swept. Some evenings, she falls asleep between us on the couch, one small hand fisted in my shirt and the other reaching even in sleep for her father's ink-stained fingers. As if some part of her already understands what took the two of us far too long and far too much heartbreak to learn, that a family isn't only the one you're born into, And it isn't only the one written into a will. Sometimes it's the one two frightened men build for each other. One secret and one confession and one 3 in the morning phone call at a time, until what started as a lie becomes against every reasonable expectation. The truest thing either of them has ever lived inside. On Amira's first birthday, we held a small gathering in the bookshop after closing string lights threaded through the poetry section, Fareed arguing loudly with my Aunt Farida about the correct way to cut a cake shaped at Russell's insistence. Like a stack of books. Delphine came, as she did every year after, holding Amira on her hip for exactly as long as Amira allowed before demanding, in the imperious way of a 1-year-old, to be handed back to her father's. Delphine had become something between an aunt and a miracle to all three of us. A woman who had carried our daughter for 8 months, and then with a generosity I don't think I'll ever fully deserve, chosen to stay in our lives instead of quietly disappearing once her part was finished. Russell asked me to marry him again that night, absurdly, formally, down on one knee on the same floorboards where he'd once photographed dust motes drifting over the poetry aisle. We were already married legally on every piece of paper that mattered, and he knew it and he did it anyway. Because he said the first time had been for a will and a deadline and a version of us that hadn't yet learned to trust each other with the truth. This time he said he wanted to ask for real with nothing at stake but the two of us and the small, sticky-fingered daughter watching from Fareed's arms with the solemn interest of a 1-year-old judge presiding over a case she found mildly entertaining. I said yes, standing in the exact spot where he'd once told me I was the best thing in his frame. We didn't file any new paperwork. Priya laughed for a full minute when I told her the following week that we'd gotten engaged to a man I'd already been married to for over a year, and then she hugged me, which she had never once done in the entire history of our very professional relationship, and told me my grandmother would have adored watching this particular story unfold, deadline clause and all. I married Russell Hoover for a bookshop. I stayed for a man whose hands never quite stopped shaking with the fear of losing what he loved. And I would, given every single chance, to do it again. Choose exactly the same impossible, imperfect, entirely real path back to that hospital room at 3:17 in the morning. Back to the sound of my daughter's first furious cry. Back to the moment I finally understood that the family I'd been terrified to lose before I even had it was never fake at all. It had been real from the very first kiss in a courthouse that smelled like nervous coffee, and it will go on being real for as long as either of us is lucky enough to keep it. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.